That harsh voice in your head telling you you're not good enough, that you're failing, that you should be ashamed of yourself, that's not your voice. It's not the real you speaking. It's the echo of childhood wounds, the internalized voices of criticism, judgment, and conditional love that shaped your early years. This inner critic that seems so much like your own thoughts is actually a foreign implant, a psychological artifact from a time when you were small, vulnerable, and dependent on others for survival and acceptance. Understanding this fundamental truth can be the first step toward healing and reclaiming your authentic self. The inner critic develops as a protective mechanism during childhood, particularly in environments where love, attention, and safety were conditional upon meeting certain standards or behaving in specific ways. When a child receives messages that they are only worthy of love when they perform well, when they don't make mistakes, or when they suppress their natural emotions and needs, the developing psyche creates an internal monitoring system. This system becomes the inner critic, constantly scanning for potential failures, mistakes, or behaviors that might result in rejection or abandonment. It's not cruelty for cruelty's sake. It's a desperate attempt by the child's mind to maintain connection and safety in an unpredictable world. What makes this inner critic so insidious is how seamlessly it integrates into our sense of self. By the time we reach adulthood, this voice has been with us for so long that we mistake it for our own wisdom, our own judgment, our own perspective. We think this harsh internal commentary is simply being realistic about our flaws and limitations. But in reality, it's the voice of every adult who couldn't provide unconditional love, every teacher who shamed us for not understanding, every parent who was too stressed or wounded themselves to offer the patient, nurturing presence we needed. The inner critic is a collection of external voices that we've swallowed whole, and now they speak to us from the inside with the authority of truth. The development of this inner critic is particularly pronounced in families where emotional expression was discouraged, where children were expected to be seen and not heard, or where love was withdrawn as a form of punishment. In these environments, children learn that their natural impulses, emotions, and needs are problematic. They begin to monitor themselves constantly, anticipating criticism and trying to prevent it by becoming their own harshest judge. The child thinks, if I can catch my mistakes before anyone else does, if I can be harder on myself than they are, maybe I can avoid rejection and maintain some sense of control. This hypervigilance becomes the foundation of the inner critic's power. Trauma, whether from overt abuse or the more subtle trauma of emotional neglect, creates particularly fertile ground for the inner critic to flourish. When a child's basic needs for safety, attunement, and unconditional positive regard are not met, the developing nervous system adapts by becoming hyper-alert to potential threats. The inner critic emerges as part of this threat detection system, constantly scanning for signs that we might be about to do something that could result in rejection, abandonment, or harm. It's trying to keep us safe in the only way it knows how, by making us hyper-aware of our perceived shortcomings and pushing us to be perfect, invisible, or whatever it learned was necessary for survival.
The voice of the inner critic often carries the exact tone, language, and emotional quality of the critical voices from our childhood. If you listen carefully to your inner critic, you might recognize your mother's impatience, your father's disappointment, your teacher's frustration, or your sibling's mockery. These aren't random thoughts. They're specific echoes of specific relationships and specific moments when you felt judged, criticized, or found lacking. The inner critic has preserved these voices with remarkable fidelity, playing them back to us whenever we're in situations that remind our unconscious mind of those early experiences of criticism or rejection. Understanding that the inner critic is not your authentic voice, but rather a collection of internalized external voices is profoundly liberating. It means that the harsh judgment you've been carrying isn't actually your own assessment of yourself. It's someone else's assessment that you've been carrying around like a heavy backpack you forgot you were wearing. This recognition allows you to begin the process of separating your true self from these foreign voices, to start questioning whether these critical thoughts actually serve you or whether they're simply old programming that's outlived its usefulness. The inner critic's strategies are often sophisticated and varied. Sometimes it appears as perfectionism, pushing you to achieve impossible standards and then berating you when you inevitably fall short. Other times, it manifests as procrastination, convincing you that you're too flawed or incompetent to even try. It might show up as people-pleasing, constantly monitoring others' reactions and adjusting your behavior to avoid any hint of disapproval. Or it could present as self-sabotage, undermining your efforts just when success seems within reach, because deep down, the inner critic doesn't believe you deserve good things. What's particularly cruel about the inner critic is how it disguises itself as helpful or protective. It tells you it's just trying to keep you from making mistakes, from embarrassing yourself, from being rejected or hurt. It presents itself as the voice of reason, the realistic assessment of your limitations, the necessary counterbalance to what it calls your unrealistic hopes and dreams. But this is a lie. The inner critic isn't protective, it's punitive. It doesn't help you grow, it keeps you small. It doesn't prevent pain, it causes it, constantly and relentlessly. The difference between the inner critic and genuine self-reflection is crucial to understand. Healthy self-reflection is curious, kind, and growth-oriented. It asks questions like, what can I learn from this experience? Or, how might I approach this differently next time? The inner critic, by contrast, is harsh, absolute, and shame-based. It makes statements like, you're such an idiot, or you always mess everything up, or you're never going to amount to anything. Healthy self-reflection seeks understanding and improvement. The inner critic seeks to punish and diminish.
How are you feeling right now as you're listening to this? Does any of this resonate with your own experience? Can you recognize your own inner critic in these descriptions? I want you to know that if you're nodding along, if you're feeling that familiar ache of recognition, you're not alone. Almost everyone who grew up in an imperfect world, which is to say, everyone, has some version of this inner critic. It's not your fault that this voice developed, and it's not a sign of weakness or failure. It's simply what happens when sensitive, vulnerable children try to make sense of a world that doesn't always offer the safety and unconditional love they need. Thank you for being here with me today, for choosing to spend this time exploring these important questions about the nature of our inner experience. You're watching Not What It Seems, where we dive deep into the hidden truths about human psychology, trauma, and healing every single day. I'm grateful that you've chosen to join this community of people who are curious about understanding themselves and their experiences at a deeper level. The fact that you're here listening to these ideas shows that you're ready to question the voices that have been guiding your life and to consider the possibility that there might be a different way of relating to yourself. Now, let's explore what happens when we begin to recognize the inner critic for what it really is. Not our own voice, but the voice of our childhood wounds. This recognition is the first step in what can be a profound transformation. When we understand that these harsh, critical thoughts are not actually our own thoughts, but rather the internalized voices of others, we can begin to create some distance from them. We can start to observe them rather than being completely identified with them. This is the beginning of what psychologists call metacognition, the ability to think about our thinking, to observe our mental processes rather than being completely caught up in them. One of the most powerful ways to begin working with the inner critic is to start listening to it with curiosity rather than automatically believing everything it says. When you notice that harsh, critical voice starting up, Try to pause and ask yourself, whose voice is this really? Who first spoke to me this way? What situation or relationship does this remind me of? Often, you'll be surprised to discover that the voice belongs to someone specific from your past, a parent, teacher, sibling, or peer who was dealing with their own pain and wounds when they spoke to you in that critical way. The process of healing the inner critic isn't about trying to eliminate it completely or pretending it doesn't exist. It's about understanding where it came from, recognizing that it developed as a survival strategy during a time when you were small and vulnerable, and then gradually learning to relate to it differently. Think of it like this. Imagine you had a guard dog that was trained to be hyper-vigilant and aggressive because you once lived in a dangerous neighborhood. Even after you moved to a safe area, that dog would continue to bark at every shadow, every sound, every potential threat. The dog isn't bad. It's just doing what it was trained to do. But now you need to retrain it to understand that the environment has changed, that not everything is a threat, and that it can relax its constant vigilance.
This process of retraining your inner critic requires patience, compassion, and consistency. It's not something that happens overnight, and it's not something you can force or rush. Remember, this voice has been with you for years, possibly decades. It's been trying to protect you in the only way it knew how. Even though its methods are often counterproductive and painful, its intention was originally to keep you safe. Approaching it with this understanding, with curiosity rather than hatred, with compassion rather than more criticism, is essential for creating real change. As you begin to recognize and work with your inner critic, you might notice that it gets louder or more insistent for a while. This is normal and doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. The inner critic is like any protective system. When it senses that its authority is being questioned, it may double down on its efforts to maintain control. Think of it like a security system that starts beeping louder when someone is trying to disarm it. The key is to stay calm, stay curious, and keep gently but firmly establishing new boundaries with this voice. One effective technique for working with the inner critic is to start talking back to it, not with more criticism or anger, but with the voice of a compassionate adult. When you hear that familiar harsh voice saying something like, "You're so stupid for making that mistake," you can respond with something like, "I hear that you're trying to protect me from making mistakes, but calling me stupid isn't helpful. I'm learning, and making mistakes is part of learning. I can acknowledge the mistake without attacking my entire worth as a person." This isn't about positive thinking or affirmations. It's about bringing adult wisdom and compassion to the parts of you that are still operating from childhood wounds. Another important aspect of healing the inner critic is understanding that it often represents not just the critical voices from your childhood, but also the wounded parts of those people who criticized you. Your parents, teachers, and other authority figures were also once children who developed their own inner critics. When they spoke to you harshly, they were often unconsciously passing on the same harsh treatment they received. This doesn't excuse their behavior or minimize the impact it had on you, but it can help you understand that their criticism was more about their own pain and limitations than about your actual worth or value as a person. The journey of healing the inner critic is intimately connected to the broader process of healing childhood trauma and developing what psychologists call secure attachment, the ability to feel safe and worthy of love in your relationships with others and with yourself. When you begin to question the voice of the inner critic, you're essentially questioning the fundamental beliefs about yourself and your worth that were formed during your earliest relationships. This can be challenging and sometimes overwhelming, which is why it's often helpful to work with a therapist or counselor who understands trauma and attachment issues.
As you continue this work, you may find that the inner critic's voice gradually becomes less frequent and less intense. You might notice that you can catch it earlier before it spirals into a full attack on your self-worth.
You might find that you can listen to it with more detachment, like listening to a radio station that you don't particularly enjoy, but that you're not required to tune into. Over time, you may discover that a new voice begins to emerge, a voice that is genuinely your own, not the echo of childhood wounds, but the authentic expression of your adult wisdom and compassion. This authentic voice is quite different from the inner critic. It's gentle but honest, supportive but not enabling, encouraging but not unrealistic. It speaks to you the way you would speak to a dear friend who was struggling, with kindness, understanding, and genuine care for your well-being. It acknowledges your mistakes and limitations without condemning you as a person. It celebrates your successes without minimizing them or immediately pointing out what you could have done better. It offers guidance without punishment, support without conditions, and love without requirements. The development of this authentic inner voice is one of the most significant gifts you can give yourself. It's the voice that will guide you through challenges with wisdom rather than fear, that will support you through difficulties with compassion rather than criticism, and that will celebrate your growth and achievements with genuine joy rather than suspicious skepticism. This voice doesn't develop overnight, and it may take consistent practice and patience to cultivate, but it's always there, waiting beneath the layers of childhood conditioning and trauma. What's particularly beautiful about this healing process is that as you learn to speak to yourself with more compassion and understanding, you naturally begin to extend that same compassion to others. When you stop attacking yourself for your imperfections and mistakes, you become more accepting of the imperfections and mistakes of others. When you recognize that your inner critic was formed by the wounds of childhood, you can more easily recognize that the critical, judgmental behaviors of others are also expressions of their own childhood wounds, rather than accurate assessments of your worth. This shift in perspective can transform not only your relationship with yourself, but also your relationships with others. You become less reactive to criticism because you understand that it often says more about the person giving it than about you. You become more able to offer genuine support and encouragement to others because you've learned how to offer it to yourself. You become more resilient in the face of challenges because you have an internal source of compassion and wisdom rather than just an internal source of criticism and judgment.
As we near the end of our exploration today, I want to offer you a reflection to carry with you. The next time you hear that familiar critical voice in your head, try to pause and ask yourself, is this really my voice? Or is this the voice of someone who was wounded and couldn't give me the unconditional love I needed? Remember that your worth as a human being was never dependent on your performance, your achievements, or your ability to meet impossible standards. You were worthy of love and acceptance simply because you existed, simply because you were a child who needed care and nurturing. That fundamental worth hasn't changed, no matter what your inner critic might tell you. The journey of healing the inner critic is not just about feeling better about yourself, though that's certainly part of it. It's about reclaiming your authentic self, the self that existed before it was covered over by layers of protective strategies and internalized criticism. It's about discovering who you really are beneath the wounds and defenses, and learning to live from that authentic place, rather than from the place of fear and criticism that the inner critic represents. This work requires courage because it means questioning voices and beliefs that have been with you for so long that they feel like truth. It requires patience because healing happens slowly, in layers, with setbacks and breakthroughs along the way. It requires compassion because you're essentially reparenting yourself, offering to the wounded parts of yourself the understanding and acceptance they never received. And it requires faith that beneath the criticism and judgment, there is something beautiful and whole and worthy of love.
I hope that today's exploration has given you some new perspective on that critical voice in your head, and perhaps some hope that it doesn't have to be the dominant voice in your inner dialogue. If this resonated with you, I'd love for you to give this video a like to let me know it was helpful. And if you're feeling called to share your own experience with the inner critic, or if you have questions about anything we've discussed today, please feel free to leave a comment below. I read every single one and often respond personally. If you're ready to continue this journey of self-discovery and healing, consider watching the next video that's appearing on your screen right now. And if you'd like to join this community of people who are committed to understanding themselves at a deeper level, feel free to subscribe to Not What It Seems. Thank you for being here with me today, and remember, you are so much more than your inner critic would have you believe.